I mix what I like. All right, what's up, world? Welcome to another edition of I Mix What I Like. I Mix What I Like.org, at I Mix What I Like for all your relevant social media. Again, I'm Jared Ball, happy to be your host. And today we're joined once again by Karl Evanzz, who, among many other things, is an author, researcher, journalist, and currently back out again with the limited 25th anniversary edition of the classic The Judas Factor, subtitled this time, The Life and Death of Malcolm Shabazz. Karl Evanzz, welcome back to the show. Thanks again for joining us.
Oh, well, thank you, Jared.
So let's just get to the quick headline then. What is new in the 25th anniversary edition of the book, and what does the Judas Factor argue is important to understand about the life and death of Malcolm X or Malcolm Shabazz?
Okay, well, there are many things new in there, but most importantly, the actual assassins are identified beyond any question for the first time. Their names being Norman Butler, Thomas Hagen, and then a guy in Newark named William Bradley. There's video clips of them in the book, and it's also on the web, on the internet. So we know beyond any question now at this point who actually shot Malcolm X. More importantly, I talk about the implications of the intelligence community. I try to clarify that better in this edition, showing pretty much the timeline that involved the CIA, the FBI, and members of the Nation of Islam who were being duped basically to kill Malcolm X. And finally, there's a brief mention of the assassination of Dr. King. We know now the weapon used came directly from the FBI. It was on loan from the Pentagon, from the military. So those are two of the most important things. But lastly, I emphasize more Malcolm's international connections and show how most of the people that Malcolm was connected to were either overthrown or assassinated themselves following his assassination. So this was basically like a scorched earth policy, where they were trying to get rid of anyone in the international community who might be interested in fostering the black nationalist movement or any revolutionary movement. So those are the main points of the book. But in the beginning of the book, I also talk about the death of Malcolm's father, which has long been rumored to have been at the hands of the Klan, the Ku Klux Klan. Now, as you know, Bruce Perry refuted this, saying that there was no Klan in Lansing at the time of his death in 1931, when in fact the state headquarters of the Klan was in Lansing itself. And I also talk about where Malcolm was killed, where Malcolm's father was killed. Earl Little was killed in Lansing. It was a very popular corner for the Klan. And finally, I clear up one of the biggest lies that was perpetrated by Manning Marable and the news media, and has not been refuted at this point, as of this point, which is that Malcolm had a homosexual relationship with this Boston Brahmin, which was a complete fabrication. And I show who the person was who did have the affair with this Brahmin. In fact, it was an associate of Malcolm X, but more importantly, it was the best friend of Malcolm Jarvis, who was one of the sources for Manning Marable's bogus allegations. So those are some of the main points of the book.
Well, to that last point, I just want to leave that there and only bring it back to highlight that in Marable's work, among many others who have made reference to that, there has just never been any evidence offered. It just becomes a repeated trope almost.
A perpetual lie.
But you do. I did want to quickly shout you out specifically because as I'm looking at it, even in here, you not only do clear up the death of Malcolm's father, but in some ways, in some quite graphic terms, literally with graphic representation, obviously not of the death itself, but represented in a way so that people can see what really happened, by whom and why. And so could you talk just briefly about who Malcolm's father was and why he was killed and why that is relevant to Malcolm's life itself?
Sure. Yeah, Earl Little was a black nationalist and a very ardent Garveyite from really the time in 1917, from the moment Garvey hit the United States. Earl Little was a convert, and he stayed with the movement up until the time of his death. He was very pro-black, as Malcolm talked about in his book, and he was married though to Malcolm's mother, as most people would know, was a very light-skinned West Indian. In fact, she was often mistaken for white. And this caused issues in most of the places where they moved to because of miscegenation laws. Some people simply did not want to see a black man married to a white woman. So that was one of the main problems that they had. They kept moving around to avoid some of the racism that they were running into. At any rate, they moved to Lansing, and Malcolm's father. This was during the Depression, by the way, that he became very pro-black in terms of employment. There was a huge fight for jobs, and Malcolm's father and mother, along with a colleague, formed an employment agency. And since there was great competition for jobs, some of the whites in Lansing resented this. Adding further to the mix was Malcolm's parents' decision to move into a white neighborhood. And they were basically trying to find land where they could grow, crops and things like that, and raise poultry and things. So they signed a contract for 5 acres of land, thinking that would be okay. But what happened is the white agent representing them did not tell the family, did not tell the Littles that there was a restrictive covenant in the contract, which prevented them from actually moving onto the land that they bought. So they could buy the land, but they couldn't move onto the land. They could lease it out to another white person, but at any rate, they could not inhabit the very land that they bought, which they didn't know. And once they bought the land, there was a movement by the community to get them out of there, to have them, basically push off their own land. And what happened is that once this started, the NAACP, which is something that hasn't been mentioned by anybody, by the way, the NAACP decided to take the Littles case to the courts and as a contest, as a test case for restrictive covenants, racial covenants. This caused a great deal of anger and reaction in the white community there. At any rate, and the house was burned down. The house that the Littles lived in was burned down. Now, after the fire, there was a gasoline can found in the basement, and the police said, well, Earl Little set the house on fire himself, and he hid the evidence in the basement, which is crazy, but it has strong repercussions, in 1965, when Malcolm was accused of doing the very same thing, of burning his house down and hiding and leaving a can of a bottle of gasoline in his daughter's room. But that aspect alone shows the intelligence community's role in the fire of Malcolm's case.
So that's
Earl Little's case.
Okay, yeah, go ahead, wrap that up. Yeah, I'm sorry, go ahead, yeah.
Yeah, well, at any rate, the house was burned down, and not long after that, Earl was walking across town to pick up some money owed to him, and he was murdered. Some people said he was pushed onto the tracks. Others said that he was knocked unconscious and then laid on the tracks. Now, if you look at the autopsy, the medical report from the hospital, that seems.
We would wish that would have been the case.
Precisely, there is no autopsy report, but if you look at the.
No, I'm saying that he would have been knocked out first, but you show something different.
Right. That makes if you look at if you look at his injuries as described by his the medical examiner and Malcolm's brothers, his oldest brother particularly, who saw the body, it looked like he was run over as dead weight. In other words, he was not alive when he was killed because the injuries are symmetrical. If you put, for example, a bag of flour on railroad tracks, they would make a track a certain way. They would run across a symmetrical point on that bag. So looking at this as Malcolm's father as dead weight, you would see that the train ran over his left leg and his left arm and nearly cut his face. But those symmetrical injuries are consistent with him being dead and being unable to move when he was killed. So that's why I believe strongly that what Malcolm said, that his father was indeed killed by the Klan. He was killed less than a block from where he used to live, which was a very racist neighborhood, and they had to move from that neighborhood for that very reason, that he was being threatened with death. And another point is that shortly after he opened his employment agency, the family started receiving death threats. So that was a problem. That was an ongoing problem with the Littles. In fact, he closed the employment agency for a while due to the death threats, which that's what is implicated by a comment that his wife made when he left the house that day, that Earl, don't go out today. If you do, you won't come back. So very clearly there was something going on that she just sensed, it was not ideal for him to go out that evening. But he said, I'll be okay, don't worry about it. And sure enough, he was killed and found near a Klan hangout. So that's the thing I want to talk about. But also, the CIA knew about his father's death in 1965, and they were doing these psychological mind games on people at the time. They were doing a lot of experimental the whole LSD experiments and all that. They were doing mind experimentation with people.
And not that I want to continue to promote this as an outlet,
right.
But the Netflix documentary Wormwood is a great piece to watch to get some context to the point you're just making there about the CIA's involvement with drugs and LSD in particular, and what they do to people. Right. What they do to people who why they were developing it, first of all, as a technique to manipulate targeted populations and captured enemies. And then when one of their own wants to reveal what is being done, or not even that, wants to simply stop participating in that project, he's thrown out of a window. So anyway.
Precisely right.
Yeah. Right. But I wanted to talk a little bit about,
go ahead.
but I wanted to listen because, I know we don't have all that much time, and your book is, more than 500 pages, is meticulously sourced, and we will encourage people to read it and review it and reach their own conclusions. But I do want to just have you summarize again, not only your theory of Malcolm's death, but why he was killed, and then precisely where the CIA or the intelligence agencies figure into this as you see it.
Okay, well, I think the main reason he was killed is that he was fostering or promoting a United Nations petition accusing the United States government of denying human rights to the African American people. That was the thrust of his plan. And the CIA, initially the government said, we won't worry about that. He hasn't a chance in hell of getting any support, from African or Asian or Latino countries or Latin American countries. And to their shock and their surprise, Malcolm did indeed, during his trips to Africa, get a lot of support for his petition, and it was supposed to come to the before the United Nations.
By the way, Karl, can I just interrupt for a quick second? What do you think it means to the struggle for Black American liberation that there are efforts like that Malcolm was making to unite with other colonized and oppressed communities around the world?
Well, it's huge. Because at that time, in the 1960s, mid-1960s, of course, there was, as Malcolm said, there was a worldwide revolution going on. You saw it everywhere. Cuba was just the beginning, was the tip of the iceberg in terms of, non-white people rising up against colonialists and their oppressors and saying, listen, it's time to lift the yoke. And if you won't do it, we'll do it ourselves. So you had guys like Fidel Castro, Che Guevara, Ahmed Ben Bella in Algeria, the Great French Revolution, the great overthrowing the French government in Algeria. There are just legions of them, and Malcolm was connected with all of those guys. Babu, in Tanzania, Jonas Savimbi, for example, he was on the same ship with Jonas Savimbi and some other revolutionaries. Amilcar Cabral in 1964. They were all in Egypt. All these revolutionaries have been singled out, and Malcolm was among those. I think about 35 of them, revolutionaries on the Isis and Osiris boat in Egypt, talking about the importance of revolutionary movements and talking about how to, execute these things. So that was very important, and again, the CIA was completely caught off guard by it. And once the African nations, for example, Ghana with Nkrumah, and again, Babu and Tanzania and some of the other countries started coming to Malcolm's defense and promoting his plan, his UN petition, that upset the White House, particularly Benjamin Reed, who was a White House key advisor there. He's the one who first contacted the CIA saying, look, Malcolm is hanging out with all these world revolutionaries, and he's in effect renounced his American citizenship. So why can't you treat him the same way you treat these other, worldwide revolutionaries like Che Guevara and Fidel Castro? At the time, the government was the American government, the CIA specifically, was trying to assassinate them. So Benjamin Reed said to the CIA, why don't you treat Malcolm the same way you treat them? In other words, why don't you kill him? And it's around that time that when Richard Helms replied, he said, well, listen, we have certain reservations about killing our own citizens. However, we will look into this. And it was around that time that the assassins, the five-team assassins, the five-member assassin team was recruited to kill Malcolm X. So I thought that was very interesting that, the very time these actual assassins were recruited is the same time that the CIA has been asked to kill Malcolm X. So I think that's very important to think about.
I also think it's important that, as you point out, the relationship in terms of citizenship and the rest of the world, that all of or how that plays out in all of this. In other words, seeing Malcolm, or the tendency among anyone in the Black or brown liberation struggle to see themselves connected with the international struggle, is in effect giving up your citizenship and allowing yourself to be opened up to all that means, obviously, and the ramifications that you lay out clearly.
Sure, yeah. Right, and in fact, I use as a parallel case the instance of William Patterson and Paul Robeson. They had the same idea in the 1950s. We should bring, human rights abuse charges against the United States to the United Nations, and they had the same experience. Paul Robeson was castigated and blacklisted, and he ended up broke. He went from $100,000 a year, I think, in 1948 or 50, to in 1952 he was only making like $3,000 a year, because that's what happened. The government went after him, and they revoked his passport. And in the case of his friend William Patterson, he was overseas when the government revoked his passport, basically leaving him in no man's land.
So we have to invite people to imixwhatilike.org also to check out the audio that we preserved there from an event convened by then Congresswoman Cynthia McKinney, where Paul Robeson Jr. lays out all the details about what you're talking about, and specifically what the state did in attempting to assassinate him, and somewhat successfully disrupting his personal life, and even his mentality, his mental stability, rather.
Again, that gets back to the mind game thing. I mean, if you look online, there's plenty of government documents out there. There were numerous mind control experiments going on at that time, where this was considered the new frontier in war, mind control. I'm sure most people have heard about the Manchurian Candidate. It was a famous movie starring Frank Sinatra, based on a book. So, I mean, that was.
And then Denzel. Some will only know it by the Denzel version of Manchurian Candidate. No. I'm just saying that.
Yeah, that's much more, true to the book itself.
Right.
But again, if you just do government mind control, you'll find a slew of documents out there. Medical journals and things like that have been produced on these programs run by the government. So yeah, they were doing, as they say, a mind control thing on Paul Robeson. They talked about it. In fact, the FBI file on Dick Gregory talks about, we should try to drive him insane, and just have him saying crazy things and discredit him that way, since we can't assassinate him, because we failed to do that.
Well, Dick, at the end of his life, was saying that the CIA actually did carry out the assassination, and that even what we think we know about how it was carried out is wrong, that the bullets came from above.
Right. Yeah,
but go ahead.
Sadly, Gregory kind of went off the deep end, I think, toward the end of his life. I mean, some of the things that he was saying were simply, wholly illogical. For example, that, George Zimmerman didn't kill Trayvon Martin. So I thought it was ironic that they tried to...
Oh, I hadn't heard that one.
Yeah, he's sort of saying some pretty unorthodox things. And, of course, we all know that Malcolm was not shot from the balcony. That is completely inconsistent with the wounds. So, yeah, I mean, he did a great many things, but toward the end, I think some of the things he said were not on point.
Now, just lastly, from what I remember, I've only read a few sections of the latest edition, but from what I remember of the original, you seemed, my memory at least tells me that there was more emphasis put on the role of the Nation of Islam. You seem to have expanded your emphasis on the role of the state. Do I have that right? And could you just clarify a little bit of that? Yeah.
Yeah. Well, no, I've always maintained that the Nation of Islam was basically duped into killing Malcolm X. In other words, they thought they were doing their own thing, but in fact, there were so many informants within the Nation of Islam and in Malcolm's group that it was very simple, for the government to kill Malcolm X at that point. So yeah, the Nation of Islam has bragged about, no, we did it. People think the government did it, but they're so wrong. They had nothing to do with it. Well, the Nation of Islam is simply misguided. They tried many times to kill Malcolm X after his expulsion in March 1964. And they bungled every attempt. And it wasn't until the government became involved that the Nation of Islam was actually able to carry out the assassination. I mean, but again, if you look at the files, you will see that the Nation of Islam was simply riddled by that time with informants. And Malcolm's group was also riddled with informants. So, they are giving themselves misplaced a pat on the back when they talk about that they killed Malcolm X. They were simply pawns, like a lot of other people. The assassins were members of the Nation of Islam, but if you look at the interviews that they've given, you will see that they were taking orders from somebody else. And generally these orders came from people who were suspected informants or who were actual informants. And one of the main members of the Nation of Islam, in fact, at the time, is a suspected FBI informant. So the FBI, the government's role in his assassination is very clear. I mean, they were tracking him every minute of the day. The FBI files talk about agents working in shifts to watch Malcolm X. I mean, they sat outside of his house. They listened to every phone call that he made. Even overseas, they had his phones tapped. So, I mean, they were tracking him, and after he's killed, less than a week after he's killed, the government basically the CIA shuts down its project on Malcolm X, basically saying mission accomplished. And for some odd reason, one of the last memos in Malcolm's file from the FBI is that Hoover wants photographs from the assassination as a teaching mechanism for future FBI agents. I mean, that's very bizarre. He wants photographs from the assassination itself to use at the FBI Academy to teach FBI agents about assassinations.
Karl Evanzz.
Yes.
No, that is fascinating, and as is much of what you've written here again, and we thank you for it. How do people get the book?
Well, it's basically it's at black bookstores if you can locate one in your community, but it's also available on Amazon at this point.
All right.
Retail is $25.99, but it's discounted to $19.95. Again, it's very freely available, and if anybody orders it from Amazon, they will get an autographed copy.
All right. Well, again, it's the limited 25th anniversary edition of The Judas Factor, The Life and Death of Malcolm Shabazz by Karl Evanzz, who was gracious enough to join us for a few minutes here at I Mix What I Like, and we thank you for it. So as Fred Hampton used to say, to you, and you talk about him too,
Yes.
To you we say peace if you're willing to fight for it. And thanks again, Karl Evanzz.
Well, thank you. And
All
best
right.
wishes to you.
I mix what I like, what I like, what I like.